The civil rights movements. The phases of the civil rights movement. The first phase, stressing MLK's message of nonviolent and assimilation in order to change the law and increasing public awareness, which, after African Americans continued to be abused, progressed into the second phase, encouraging cultural unity and unified resistance, proved to minorities nationwide that steps towards increasing civil rights could be made through both peaceful and violent resistance, encouraging the Native Americans to group together to successfully reclaim their stolen culture, which greatly increased Native quality of life, and motivating the Chicano Mexicans to unify under a sense of cultural nationalism to promote further social justice and political equality. Civil Rights Movement Phase 1 emphasized nonviolent protest. It was a middle path between two extremes based on Christian realism. It was led by Martin Luther King Jr., who was effective at bringing national attention into the civil rights movement. And some of the key events of the Phase 1 movement was the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington, which were both peaceful protests. And the major impacts were the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Movement Phase 2, led by Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, encouraged cultural unity and unified efforts in protests and demands for civil rights. It was justified. Their violence was justified on the argument that was self-defense and that they would gain equality by any means necessary. After 3 members of the Black Panthers were murdered, African Americans began to ask themselves if it was working fast enough, if their nonviolent protests were working fast enough, and so they started up in Berkeley, California, with Marxist and social justice for African American ideals, but they were not out for communism. The Chicano movement took inspiration from the civil rights movement, specifically the first phase. Both MLK and Cesar Chavez took inspiration from Gandhi, and when MLK's nonviolent protests were getting African Americans their civil rights, Cesar Chavez replicated that process. The Chicano movement was pushing for desegregation of public and private areas like pools and parks, but also equal education opportunities. The Chicano movement added to their list by advocating for farmers' rights and making sure Latino farmers are being paid enough. Native Americans were outraged about the discrimination and poverty they faced in America. Native American suicide was 2 times that of the average person. The average Native American lifespan was 46 years old compared to the 69 average American lifespan. Some natives landed on Alcatraz and claimed it as Indian territory. And when the government tried to persuade them to leave, the Native Americans only slowly left over a course of 19 months. Years later, Native Americans marched on D.C. and laid out demands for better housing and education, as well as the return of native lands. The federal government didn't give in to these demands and instead started a gunfight that lasted for 71 days. The violence occurred during the Native American protests was started by the federal government, and the Native Americans used self-defense to justify their violence. This parallels Malcolm X's teaching of self-defense against discrimination, although the Native Americans took that literally and remained peaceful until they were under fire, as opposed to Malcolm X's belief that since African Americans were being so largely discriminated against, their violence classified as self-defense. Evidently, both the first stage emphasizing peaceful protests, raising public awareness, and encouraging the passing of governmental acts, and the following stage, stressing cultural unity and unified resistance of racism, were monumental steps towards combating the social inequalities and economic challenges of African Americans, with the stages combining not only to encourage government officials to pass acts such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also to further bring public awareness to the fight for equality. Furthermore, the success of the African American civil rights movement encouraged other minority and largely oppressed groups to fight for their own equality, such as Chicanos and natives who led movements to increase civil rights and celebrate their unique cultures.